shift work disorder falls into a category of sleep disorders. We call them circadian rhythm sleep disorders. Before the invention of light bulb, there wasn't any night shifts, so to speak, because everyone go to sleep. That is what creates a misalignment, and then individuals who are prone to see more consequences, they tend to feel the consequences more, in the sense they feel very tired, they feel very sleepy when they are supposed to be awake and working, so it messes up with their productivity, their focus. A lot of these folks will say, oh my gosh, maybe I have ADHD, and you can see how all these other things can get mislabeled, even though it's only a problem between their circadian alignment. It is a real problem. It's not just in your head. It will impact and put you in the harm's way if you don't manage it properly.
Welcome back to the Hidden Sleep Disorder Show. So if you work nights, rotating shifts, or early mornings, and you can't figure out why your sleep never feels right, this episode is for you. Dr. Sandy's here joining us today to talk about shift work disorder, a real medical condition and not just an occupational hazard. So we were chatting before we started to record, and I had never heard about this. I did not know that this was a thing. So I was like, I don't know if this was general knowledge that I didn't know about, or if it's common that people don't know. So I'm excited for this episode.
You said it right. Let's dedicate this to all the shift workers in the world. And I was reading few facts about it. Almost 20 to 30% of people in industrialized world actually work these different shifts. So there's plenty of people out there who work all different kinds of shifts, evening shifts, early morning shifts, rotating shifts, so let's dedicate this to all our shift workers, and let's dive in.
Absolutely. So I'm so curious about this. So a lot of shift workers assume or feel that, feeling off might just be part of the job. But what exactly is shift work disorder, and how is it different from just, let's say, being tired from working an odd or not typical schedule?
So shift work disorder falls into a category of sleep disorders. We call them circadian rhythm sleep disorders. And there are quite a few, and shift work is one of them. So for example, there is a circadian rhythm sleep disorder, delayed sleep phase. There is a circadian rhythm sleep disorder, advanced sleep phase. What's the difference between those two? Meaning, hey, I cannot fall asleep. You've heard of the term night owl? So those are the folks who have delayed circadian rhythm sleep disorder, especially if they're feeling somehow limited by their sleep timing. So they go to bed super late. They can't fall asleep at regular nighttime. On the other hand, the other spectrum is the advanced sleep phase circadian rhythm disorder, where I'm going to sleep way too early, at 5, 6 p.m., 7 p.m. I can't stay awake, past 4 or 5 p.m. And a lot of this I see in my elderly population. Then the third one is where there's irregular sleep-wake pattern, where it's just all over the place. It's delayed some weeks, it's advanced some weeks, and so it's a mix of those two, and it's called irregular. And then the fourth one is where the shift work disorder comes into play, which is the circadian rhythm sleep disorder shift work type, meaning I have to be working an atypical shift. For example, I'm working in the evenings, or I'm working nights, or I have an early morning shift. And then there is what we hear in real life, some people call it, hey, I'm on swing shift, meaning some days I'm working days, some days I'm working nights, some days I'm working early morning. So that's a swing shift, so to speak. So very, very taxing on our bodies. So that's what this shift work disorder is part of that group, where there is a misalignment between my circadian cycle in my body. So our body has its inherent intrinsic sleep rhythm or circadian rhythm. And every single cell has it in our body, and it's a little bit longer than 24 hours, but it's safe to assume it's set by the light and dark cycle in our, so sunrise to sunset. That's basically is determining what our circadian cycle is set at. And you have to reset it every day. So that's why the early morning exposure to light is very important to keep that alignment in place. And once that alignment disrupts, that is what causes a lot of these problems. And shift work is a prime example because that's sort of man-made thing, right? Before the invention of light bulb, there wasn't any night shifts, so to speak, right? Because everyone go to sleep, or at least most people would. So that is what creates a misalignment. And then individuals who are prone to see more consequences, they tend to feel the consequences more, in the sense they feel very tired, they feel very sleepy when they are supposed to be awake and working. So it messes up with their productivity, their focus. A lot of these folks will say, oh my gosh, maybe I have ADHD. And you can see how all these other things can get mislabeled, even though it's only a problem between their circadian alignment and what shift they're working. As far as its toll on the sleep, it messes up my sleep because a lot of these shift workers, they lose a lot of sleep. So it's sort of a double whammy. I'm dealing with the impact of sleep loss, where I don't have enough sleep hours. And then I'm dealing with the impact of misalignment between my intrinsic circadian cycle and my actual hours when I'm being awake or when I'm being asked to sleep, which may not be nothing that I would naturally do if I wasn't doing that shift work.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I had so many different thoughts while you were saying that, because that's why I didn't think it was a disorder. I just thought if you're, you work at night, you're not seeing the sun, you're going to feel off or you're going to feel tired. So I'm sure people who do have those shifts
Exactly. So
just
let
think
me
that.
dive in a little bit deeper. So when does it become a disorder from just a regular shift work, right? So here are a few sort of clinical criteria that we have to look for. One, is it impacting my quality of work? Is it impacting my work life, in the sense that, hey, let's say I'm a nurse in the ER or in the ICU and I work nights, but is it messing up with how much I can focus or I'm able to, take care of things? If that's the case, then it's already turned into a disorder. Okay. If it's one-off thing, then not really. And so there is a timeline criteria here as well. So these symptoms have to last for at least 3 months. If you had one off day, all of us have one off day where we don't really are on top of our game. But if it's a consistent thing and it's been happening to me for more than 90 days, more than 3 months, that's when it sort of becomes a problem. So that's another thing to remember, that if it's only like, hey, I had it for 2 days, 5 days, that's not shift work disorder. Has to be minimum of 90 days criteria. So that's how you would differentiate whether am I dealing with a real problem that's not going away, or was it just something that happened at work that night and messed me up for a short term?
So 3 months is about that time frame if people are
That's correct.
experiencing it for 3 months. So then
That's
it seems like the body is kind of working against these schedules almost from the very beginning. So can you explain what's happening biologically when someone actually works against their natural circadian rhythm this way?
So, yes, so our biological rhythm is completely dependent on sunrise and sunset, those cues. And that kind of cues my brain, my body cells, and not just the brain. Every single cell scientists have discovered is they have these circadian clock genes, and those genes determine the circadian cycle at a cellular level. So then, if I'm somehow creating artificially a situation where I'm sleeping in a misaligned way, so basically my circadian clock says I should be sleeping, for example, and I'm just making this up. Let's say it's saying I should sleep from 10 p.m. till 6 or 7 in the morning. But then I'm supposed to be working because I gotta earn a livelihood or I gotta do a rotation or whatever. So then I'm artificially going against my biology, against my genetic circadian cycle. And that misalignment is the sort of underlying root cause of the problem. Now, some people, some cells, some bodies will be able to manage and tolerate that better versus others who are genetically more predisposed or more vulnerable. They're going to see bad outcomes, big consequences, because then when they're at work at nighttime, they're busy fighting sleepiness. When they come back home, they're busy fighting wakefulness because then they can't sleep during the daytime. So then it turns into a big sleep loss. And so, in fact, there are studies that show that shift workers, they pretty much lose anywhere between 1 to 4 hours of sleep over a 24-hour cycle compared to a non-shift worker. So that's a big amount of chunk of sleep loss to be dealing with. And then, of course, I'm dealing with the consequences of sleep loss. So it's a double whammy. One, it's working against my biological circadian rhythm. And two, I'm dealing with the consequences of sleep loss. So then it sort of becomes hard to manage.
We talked about how some of these symptoms kind of seem normal, especially with like atypical shifts. And I think it's common that some symptoms just get written off as normal for anyone kind of working rotating shifts or night shifts or anything like that. And you kind of touched on this, but what symptoms or specific symptoms kind of tell you that a shift worker has crossed the line from just adjusting poorly into an actual sleep disorder?
So two main sort of symptoms that we see in this population. One is the complaint of insomnia, where, hey, I can't fall asleep, I can't stay asleep when I'm wanting to. But that's not when your body, your cells, your genes, your brain is ready for sleep. Because to them, they're still in that wakefulness phase as far as their circadian rhythm is concerned. So insomnia becomes a big symptom. The second symptom becomes hypersomnia, which is excessive sleepiness. When I should be more wakeful, I should be able to drive without feeling drowsy. I should be able to work at top of my game without feeling drowsy. And so these folks are dealing with a lot of excessive sleepiness. So those two really, either it's going to be one or the other, but generally I see both in the same person. And then as a clinician, we're scratching our head. It's like, okay, which one is what? But it's part of the same problem. And that's the underlying misalignment from my biological circadian rhythm to what I've artificially created as a shift work.
Absolutely. And you kind of touched on this as well, but this condition seems to reach obviously beyond just feeling exhausted at work. So what are some of the longer term risks that are actually tied to shift work disorder if it does go unaddressed or undiagnosed?
Quite a few, actually. I mentioned loss of productivity. That's a big one. I'm not going to be as productive or as focused, and I might make a lot of errors in whatever work I'm doing. There are a lot of, I'm prone to accidents. In fact, there are studies that report there is higher history of substance abuse in this population. I remember actually someone did an experiment on resident physicians and they offered them during their night shifts just to see if it was impacting their decision making, and this is just on their diet. So they placed healthy options versus high carb options, and every single time all the nighttime shift workers, they went for the high carb diet.
Like, shout out to all the healthcare workers that work overnight because, and I found this out, I guess, a few years ago, but like nurses will work, these crazy, like long shifts and then like 4 days in a row or like 3 days off or some kind of schedule like that. And I always wondered, it's such an important job. It's so, so important to be up for that many hours and just have to be mentally on it. I've always wondered how people do that because I know I would mentally be checked out.
There's a lot of history on that. In fact, I remember back in 2010 as a resident physician, that's when they strictly came about with an 80-hour work week rule for the incoming residents. Prior to that, there was no such rule. So you could be working 90, 110, 120 hours a week, and you're just constantly working tired. And then I think someone ended up getting into a car accident and dying. And so there was a lot of advocacy around that. So then, all the powers to be, they sort of come up with the way to reduce the hour. 80 hours a week is still a lot of hours to be working, but imagine life before that. So you're absolutely right. There are certain groups of occupations that have a very high burden of this.
That's so interesting. And I know, well, most shift workers can't really just, go and quit their job or change their schedule overnight. But for someone who can't change their work hours, what treatment options or strategies do you recommend to manage this?
So, yes, it can be quite challenging trying to fight against your own genetics, against your own biology. So, yes, managing is a good term because I don't think there's really any treatment for this. So, all you can do is really manage it. And, I see a lot of cops and police officers who are on these brutal shifts as well, and that's another group that is, they have swing shifts. And if you're new to the force, you just join, you don't have that level of seniority. So then guess what? You're getting all these, late night, early morning shifts, and that it becomes extremely hard to manage those. So some of the things that a person needs to do or should be doing to manage is to one have a very consistent schedule, because what ends up happening is we tend to revert back to our normal sort of cycle, so to speak. So let's say I work night shifts for 3 days, then I stay awake at night and sleep during the daytime. But as soon as I'm off, I'm trying to stay awake all day long and then trying to flip back and forth, which actually is much harder to deal with versus keeping the schedule, even on your off days, to keep it consistent as if you were working night shifts, especially if you don't see any changes in your situation anytime soon. So what that allows is to sort of let the brain go into at least some rhythm so that it's not fighting back and forth into these swings, basically. So that's one important thing to remember. The second one is that, especially for people who deal with more insomnia, yes, I did great during my night shift, and then during the daytime, I'm trying to sleep. So then they need to make sure they have a quiet and peaceful sleep environment, because the world around us doesn't stop. In fact, it just comes alive during the daytime. So a lot of these folks will need to create environment where kids are not around disturbing you or dogs are not, so you have to make sure that you treat that sleep time, that phase where you're planning to sleep, with the same intensity as if you were trying to sleep at night. So you got to keep your room dark. You got to keep it cool, so all those things will matter. And in fact, there are a lot of people, despite doing all that, it still doesn't really keep them asleep. And then we have to utilize sleep aids or sleeping medications to help them get more restful sleep. So it can become very, very challenging. Other thing that I usually tell some of these folks who have long commutes, and if I'm going back from work and it's bright sun shining in my eyes, it's going to delay your sleep as you're trying to go to sleep. You're already fighting your biology. And then on top of that, if you have a lot of light exposure happening to you early morning, it's going to make it harder for you to fall asleep. So generally we tell these folks to use dark glasses, tinted car, windshields and whatnot to minimize that light exposure that's happening to them.
I just had a thought that's somewhat related, but for example, people that we've talked about before with narcolepsy that struggle sometimes with driving, if they have it, make it darker and they struggle with narcolepsy, does that ever happen? They can overlap, I'm sure, right? Is that common?
Yeah, you can have both, but narcolepsy patients are, extremely sleepy no matter what. So they're sleeping, 10, 12, 16 hours. And regardless of that, they're still complaining of excessive sleepiness. The shift work disorder, on the other hand, they're struggling at work. They're struggling to sleep during the daytime. And you're absolutely right. In a right person, it can become extremely, extremely challenging to pick them apart. And that's where all the tools of testing, the actigraph, the sleep studies are going to come into play to differentiate those for us.
So interesting. And so there's probably a point where this stops being something to really manage alone. So at what point should a shift worker stop trying to just push through and actually see a sleep specialist about this?
So you're right. It is tough. Even with the help of a clinician, it's going to be tough. So I can't imagine dealing with it all by yourself. So you're absolutely right. So one, the criteria that we talked about at the start, that if you've been struggling for more than 3 months, then it's not going to go away by itself. And then you really need some professional on your side. So that's number one thing to remember. Number two, depending on how intense these symptoms are impacting my workday or my nighttime sleep, how distressed I am. So before, it starts to mess up my mood, starts to mess up my relationship, starts to mess up my social obligations, that's really when you need to take some action. And that's the hardest thing, that I'm so tired. All I want is just to go and crawl in my bed and not really seek any help. Because you can just keep blaming, oh, I just need more sleep. I just need more sleep. But that sleep isn't coming. So then what do you do? So I think that's how one can determine how to seek help.
Absolutely. And we just talked about this a little bit with light exposure with sleeping. And I think that there's probably a lot of conflicting advice out there about napping and light exposure for people, especially on odd schedules. So how should shift workers be using naps and light exposure to work with their bodies instead of against them?
So, who hire these night shift workers, they may utilize, or they should utilize, a lot of bright lighting. And the more light exposure those workers have, it's better for their brain to feel more alert, less accidents, less workplace accidents. And the same logic for when I'm trying to sleep during, everyone else's daytime, but my nighttime, is to make sure my room is dark and I don't have a lot of light exposure happening. So light, it plays a crucial role. It helps us stay alert and awake, if it's bright and the right intensity. And then it can also disrupt my sleep if I'm not managing light in my bedroom. So you have to manage light in the workplace. You have to manage light while you're driving from work to home or from home to work. And then you're having to manage light in my bedroom. And so does the temperature. Even temperature plays a role in this. If my bedroom is too hot, that's going to mess up my sleep more. So it's generally a good idea to keep my room on the cooler side, close to 65, 67 degrees. So that generally is optimal.
Good to know. Noted. I think I think mine is exactly at 67. But I've taken some tips from from these sleep shows for sure. But and it's interesting talking about the lighting, because if you're struggling with this and you don't even know that it's a disorder, you would never even really think about the different lights that you would need at all.
That's
Like
right. That's right.
blackout curtains are common, things like that. But if you don't really know you need it, it's something that wouldn't really cross your mind. That's
Yeah,
good.
and it's so easy, right? You can blame just everything on, like, oh yeah, I just need more sleep. But then you're struggling to get more sleep, right? And then what about, the other sleep disorders that still could be hidden or hiding? So you still got to rule out everything else. So if I'm at risk for sleep apnea, and I'm trying to sleep, no matter which shift I'm trying to sleep, it's still going to disrupt my sleep. So I got to take care of that as well. So yes, I think if you are experiencing what we just talked about and dealing with this, then there should not be any hesitation in seeking help.
Absolutely. And so before you can go really treat this, you actually have to confirm what's going on, which is what we were talking about. So can you kind of walk us through how shift work disorder does get diagnosed? And are we talking sleep logs? Is it a formal sleep study, or is it something else?
So the majority of the diagnosis is going to come from the clinical history, which is where we're chatting face to face and making sure there's nothing else going on. Everything else is secondary as far as shift work is concerned. So a good detailed history with a clinician is really the primary focus as to how the diagnosis is made. But there are some tools where we may ask you to keep a sleep log or sleep diary for few weeks. Actigraphy, which a lot of people now have all these smartwatches that track your sleep, so you can even show that to your clinician, and it's keeping track of, hey, what time you went to bed, what time you got out, how many times you woke up through your sleep phase. So that, or the clinician might do a more formal actigraphy of their own as well. And then the other sleep studies, for example, either home sleep test or in-lab sleep study, is to rule out underlying sleep disorders like sleep apnea and everything else that sleep studies could rule out. And that is to make sure, okay, because if I'm dealing with, let's say, sleep apnea or restless legs, those kind of things, I can easily manage them and get them out of the way. Obviously, I can't do a whole lot about changing that person's shift work, but I can optimize everything else that's in my control. So, for example, if let's say, hey, I did a home sleep test at home, but no one's really assessed my situation, then you're only going to get partial answers from that. But so you have to kind of look at a whole picture in a holistic way.
It's interesting too, because this didn't really come to mind, but now I can't unsee it. Like, this condition also doesn't just affect the person that's working the shift. It ripples out to everyone around them. So how does shift work disorder tend to really affect relationships and family life? And what have you really seen help with those issues?
So, not in a good way, obviously, right? Because my social connections are going to suffer and I'm going to be, either very irritable or cranky because I'm dealing with the sleep deprivation or sleep loss. And then I'm not just available, right? I'm doing things when I'm at work, when everyone else might be hanging out or sleeping. And I need to sleep when everyone else is doing their daytime duties. So, yes, that's the price that our shift workers pay, and it messes up with them. So, how do you manage that? That's a tough question because everyone's social situation is unique depending on, hey, do I have kids to take care of? I've had a lot of shift workers who come after work, and even though as a clinician I'm telling them, hey, why can't you go right off, as soon as you come back, go to sleep? And they're like, no, I can't. I have kids that I have to drop off to school or urgent things like that, just not gonna wait or don't care whether you're working shifts at night or days. So it becomes harder depending on what sort of social situation you are in. For a single person who has more control over their schedule, it may be a little bit easier to manage those things versus if I'm a single mom raising two kids, it's like, hey, where is the time for all this? So you have to customize the advice based on who's sitting in front of us and what are the challenges that they face in their social life.
Absolutely. Yeah. This was such an interesting conversation because I'm curious to know how many people are just existing and not knowing that this is a disorder, especially ones that are, living this life and have these atypical schedules. So I'm curious.
And we were talking about this data point, about 20% of our population is doing shift work of some sort. And so we believe out of that, at least 5% have shift work disorder. So you can imagine the numbers are quite massive for this.
Absolutely. And before we wrap up this conversation, is there anything else that you want to touch on or mention to our listeners that you haven't had the opportunity to say yet today?
I think we covered it pretty well, but I would say parting thoughts that it is a real problem. It's not just in your head. It will impact and put you in the harm's way if you don't manage it properly. And there are ways to manage it. There is no quick fix. It has to be managed through a multi sort of prong approach. So talk to a clinician, talk to a sleep doctor, and make sure you're seeking help if you're dealing with any of this stuff that we just talked about.
Absolutely. And if your schedule is fighting your body every single day, that exhaustion isn't something that you just have to accept, I think is a key takeaway from this episode. And shift work disorder, it is treatable, like you said, and it starts with recognizing it for what it is. And it is, like you said, something that is manageable. So if anyone is going through this, make sure that you do reach out to a specialist and really find a way to manage it and treat it. And for everyone listening, thank you for listening. It's been another great episode of the Hidden Sleep Disorder Show. Make sure you're following, subscribing, and sharing it with someone who can benefit from it. It was a pleasure speaking with you as always, and I can't wait to talk to you again soon.
Thank you, Leila.
Bye.